A mother meets her son after 30 years. 30 years ago, a young mother was forced to give up her newborn son. For 3 decades, she carried his tiny hospital bracelet in her purse, wondering if he was alive, happy, or even remembered her. Then one rainy afternoon, she saw a man step out of a black pickup truck. And on his wrist was the same birthmark she had kissed on the day she lost him. What happened next would change both of their lives forever. Margaret Wilson sat alone on a wooden bench outside a small cafe in Montana. At 62 years old, her silver hair moved gently in the wind as she stared at an old photograph she had looked at thousands of times. The picture showed a young woman holding a newborn baby. The woman was Margaret. The baby was the son she had not seen in 30 years. Tears filled her eyes. Every birthday, every Christmas, every Mother's Day had felt incomplete. Not because she didn't love her life. Not because she didn't have friends. But because part of her heart had disappeared the day she signed adoption papers in a hospital room. Back then she had been only 19. Scared, poor, alone, and pressured by everyone around her. Her parents had told her she couldn't raise a child. The baby's father had abandoned her before the birth. Social workers convinced her adoption would give the baby a better future. So she signed the papers. And immediately regretted it. For years she searched. But records were sealed. Names were changed. Addresses disappeared. Eventually she stopped searching. Not because she gave up. Because she ran out of places to look. Yet she never stopped loving him. Never. Across town, a 49-year-old man named Ethan Carter parked his truck outside a hardware store. Ethan was respected throughout the community. He owned a successful construction company. He was married, had 2 daughters, and lived what most people considered a happy life. But there was one question he had carried his entire life. Who was his biological mother? His adoptive parents had been wonderful. They raised him with kindness and love. But before his father died 5 years earlier, he handed Ethan a small envelope. Inside was a hospital record. A name. Margaret Wilson. His birth mother. For years Ethan kept the paper hidden in a drawer. He never knew whether he should look for her. Maybe she didn't want to be found. Maybe she had forgotten him. Maybe finding her would only reopen old wounds. So he waited. And waited. Until finally, on his 49th birthday, he decided he needed answers. 3 weeks later Ethan hired a professional investigator. The search took months. But eventually they found her. Living alone in Montana. Just 40 miles away. When the investigator handed him the address, Ethan felt his hands shake. For nearly 50 years she had been nothing more than a mystery. Now she was real. A real woman. A real person. Someone who might be thinking about him at that exact moment. He drove home and sat in his truck for over an hour. Unable to move. Unable to decide. Should he go? Should he leave the past alone? His wife Sarah finally opened the passenger door and sat beside him. "You're scared?" she said gently. Ethan nodded. "What if she doesn't want me?" Sarah smiled sadly. "What if she's been waiting 30 years for this?" The next morning Ethan drove toward Margaret's town. Rain fell steadily across the highway. His heart pounded harder with every mile. He had imagined this moment 1,000 times. But now that it was happening, he felt like a frightened child. Meanwhile, Margaret sat inside the cafe drinking coffee. She came there every Friday. The owner knew her by name. The waitress knew exactly how she liked her coffee. Life was predictable, quiet, lonely, but peaceful. Then a black pickup truck pulled into the parking lot. Margaret barely noticed, until the driver stepped out. Something about him felt familiar. Strangely familiar. The man looked around nervously before walking toward the cafe. As he pushed open the door, Margaret's heart suddenly skipped. She couldn't explain why, but she felt an overwhelming urge to keep looking at him. The man approached the counter, ordered coffee, then turned around. For a brief second their eyes met. And something happened. Neither understood it, yet both felt it. A strange connection, like two pieces of a puzzle recognizing each other. Ethan carried his coffee toward an empty table. Then he noticed the elderly woman staring at him. He quickly looked away. His palms were sweating, because he recognized her immediately. The investigator had shown him photographs. Older photos. Recent photos. And there she was. Margaret Wilson. His mother. Only a few feet away. For a moment he considered walking out. This was too much. Too emotional. Too real. But then Margaret stood, slowly, carefully, and began walking toward him. "Excuse me," she said softly. Ethan looked up. His throat tightened. "Yes." Margaret hesitated. "I know this sounds strange, but have we met before?" Ethan felt tears forming instantly. He had rehearsed dozens of speeches. Yet every word disappeared. All he could do was stare. Margaret noticed his trembling hands. And suddenly she saw something. A small birthmark near his wrist. Her eyes widened. No, it couldn't be. Could it? 30 years ago she had kissed that exact mark before nurses carried him away. Her knees nearly gave out. "Ethan," she whispered. The coffee cup slipped from Ethan's fingers. It crashed onto the floor. People turned to look, but neither noticed, because time itself seemed to stop. "How do you know my name?" Ethan asked. Margaret's lips trembled. Tears streamed down her face. "My baby." The words barely escaped her mouth. "My baby boy." The entire cafe fell silent. Ethan stood frozen. Every emotion he had buried for decades exploded inside him. Confusion, anger, hope, fear, love, pain, questions. Thousands of questions. Margaret reached toward him, then stopped. Afraid. Afraid he might pull away. Afraid he might hate her. Afraid this miracle would disappear. "I've waited 30 years, she whispered. "I never stopped looking for you." Ethan felt his eyes burn with tears. For almost 50 years he had imagined this woman. Sometimes as a villain. Sometimes as a victim. Sometimes as a stranger. Yet standing before him now was simply a mother. A broken-hearted mother. And for the first time in his life, he saw the pain in her eyes. The pain of losing a child. Neither knew what to say next. So they simply stood there. Crying. Looking at each other. Trying to make sense of a lifetime apart. Finally Ethan spoke. "Can we talk?" Margaret nodded immediately. "Yes." Her voice broke. "Please." They sat together at a corner table. A mother and son. Separated by 30 years. Connected by one impossible moment. And neither realized that the conversation about to begin would reveal secrets, heartbreaks, and truths that would forever change their lives. The truth she carried for 30 years. The cafe had become quiet again, but for Ethan and Margaret, the world felt completely different. For 30 years, they had lived separate lives. Now they sat across from each other, staring at faces that somehow felt both familiar and unfamiliar at the same time. Neither knew where to begin. A waitress quietly brought fresh coffee and left without saying a word. Margaret wiped tears from her eyes. Ethan took a deep breath. "I've imagined this moment my entire life," he said. "So have I," Margaret replied softly. For a few seconds, silence filled the space between them. Then Ethan asked the question he had carried in his heart for nearly 50 years. "Why?" Margaret lowered her eyes. The single word hit harder than anything else. Why? Why had she let him go? Why hadn't she found him sooner? Why had he grown up without knowing her? She took a shaky breath. "Because I was terrified." Ethan listened carefully. "When I became pregnant with you, I was only 19 years old." Her voice trembled. I was working at a grocery store and barely earning enough money to survive. She paused. Your father disappeared the moment he learned I was pregnant. Ethan's jaw tightened. Margaret continued. My parents were furious. They told me I had ruined my future. Tears appeared again. They said nobody would help me raise you. Ethan remained silent. I wanted to keep you. The words came out almost as a whisper. I swear to God, Ethan. I wanted to keep you. For the first time, Ethan saw genuine pain in her eyes. Not guilt. Not excuses. Pain. The kind that never completely heals. When you were born, Margaret continued, I held you in my arms for almost 6 hours. Her voice cracked. You had this tiny birthmark on your wrist. She pointed toward Ethan's arm. The nurse laughed because I kept kissing it. Ethan instinctively looked down at the small mark. The same mark he had seen every day of his life. The next morning, Margaret said, a social worker came into my room. Her hands trembled. They told me adoption was the responsible thing to do. Ethan looked away. I signed the papers. A tear rolled down her cheek. And the second I signed them, I knew I had made the biggest mistake of my life. The words hung heavily between them. For decades Ethan had imagined a woman who simply didn't want him. But that image was beginning to crumble. What happened after that? He asked quietly. Margaret swallowed hard. I tried to stop it. Ethan looked up. What do you mean? She opened her purse. Inside was an old, worn folder. The edges were yellow with age. Carefully, she pulled out several papers. I kept these. Ethan stared. Court documents, letters, applications, records. Thousands of pages. Margaret slid them across the table. I spent years trying to find you. Ethan's eyes widened. There were documents dating back decades. Requests to adoption agencies. Letters to lawyers. Petitions filed in court. Everything. I never stopped searching. Her voice broke. Not for 1 year. Ethan felt something inside him shift. For nearly half a century he had believed he was forgotten. But these papers told another story. A mother who never stopped looking. I don't understand, Ethan said. If you searched for me, why didn't you find me? Margaret sighed. Because the laws back then protected adoption records. She wiped her eyes. Your name was changed. Your address was hidden. Your records were sealed. She smiled sadly. I chased ghosts for 30 years. Ethan stared at the documents. Every page represented hope and disappointment. Hope and disappointment. Again and again. For decades. Meanwhile, memories flooded Ethan's mind. His adoptive parents. The birthday parties. The fishing trips. The bedtime stories. They had loved him completely. Yet there had always been a small empty space inside him. A question nobody could answer. Who was his mother? Now she sat right in front of him. And she wasn't the person he expected. Margaret suddenly looked nervous. There's something else you should know. Ethan's heart skipped. What? She hesitated. Then reached into the folder again. This time she removed a photograph. An old photograph. Faded from age. She handed it to him. Ethan stared. It showed a young Margaret holding a baby. Him. His eyes immediately filled with tears. It was the first photograph he had ever seen of himself as a newborn. For several seconds he couldn't speak. My God. Margaret smiled through tears. I carried that picture everywhere. Ethan carefully touched the image. As if afraid it might disappear. For the first time since arriving, anger began to fade. Not completely. But enough for understanding to take its place. Still, one question remained. A painful question. If you loved me so much. Margaret looked up. Why didn't you contact me after I turned 18? Her face fell. The answer clearly hurt. I did. Ethan frowned. What? Margaret nodded slowly. I wrote letters. His eyes widened. What letters? I wrote every year after your 18th birthday. She opened the folder again. More envelopes. Dozens of them. All addressed to him. None opened. None delivered. Ethan stared in disbelief. I don't understand. Margaret swallowed hard. The agency wouldn't tell me where you lived. Her voice shook. So I mailed letters to the last address they had. She looked away. They always came back. Ethan felt numb. For years he had believed she never tried. And now he was discovering she never stopped trying. The rain outside grew heavier. Thunder echoed in the distance. Neither noticed. They were too focused on the years they had lost. Years that could never be recovered. Birthdays missed. Graduations missed. Wedding days missed. Entire lifetimes missed. The realization hurt both of them. Finally Ethan asked another question. Did you ever have more children? Margaret's eyes filled instantly. She nodded. A daughter. Ethan blinked. I have a sister. Margaret smiled. Yes. A genuine smile this time. Her name is Lily. Ethan felt stunned. Not only had he found his mother, he had discovered a sister he never knew existed. Does she know about me? Margaret laughed softly through tears. Oh yes. She's heard about you her entire life. Ethan stared. What? Margaret nodded. Every birthday. Every Christmas. Every family gathering. She smiled sadly. I talked about my missing son. The words hit Ethan harder than he expected. Her missing son. Not the son she gave away. The son she lost. Hours passed without either noticing. Stories flowed back and forth. Margaret learned about Ethan's wife, Sarah. His daughters. His career. His life. Ethan learned about Margaret's struggles. Her second marriage. The divorce. The years she spent searching. The loneliness she carried. Piece by piece, strangers slowly became family. As evening approached, Ethan finally checked his phone. Several missed calls from Sarah. He smiled. I should probably go. Margaret's face instantly fell. Fear returned to her eyes. The same fear she'd felt 30 years ago. Fear of losing him again. Ethan noticed. For a moment neither spoke. Then Ethan stood. Margaret forced a smile. I understand. But her voice revealed her heartbreak. She was afraid this was goodbye. Afraid he would disappear once more. Then something unexpected happened. Ethan stepped around the table and wrapped his arms around her. Margaret froze. For a second she couldn't believe it. Then she hugged him back. Tightly. As though she were holding the baby she had lost decades earlier. Both began crying again. Neither cared who was watching. When they finally pulled apart, Ethan smiled. A real smile. The first one she'd seen all day. You know something? Margaret wiped her tears. What? Ethan took a deep breath. You missed 30 years. Her eyes filled again. Yes. But maybe. He smiled softly. We still have the rest. Margaret covered her mouth as fresh tears fell. For the first time in decades, hope entered her heart. Real hope. The kind she thought she'd lost forever. But neither of them knew that a shocking secret from Ethan's adoption was about to surface. A secret hidden for 30 years. A secret that would change everything they believed about the day they were separated. The secret hidden in the adoption records. The drive home felt unreal. Rain tapped against Ethan's windshield as he replayed every moment from the cafe. For nearly 50 years, he had carried questions. Now many of those questions had answers. But new ones had appeared. His mother had searched for him. She had written letters. She had never forgotten him. That truth alone changed everything. Yet something still bothered him. One detail refused to leave his mind. If Margaret had fought so hard to find him, why had it been almost impossible for both of them to reconnect? Why had every path led to a dead end? Something didn't feel right. That evening, Ethan sat at his kitchen table with Sarah. He showed her the old photographs Margaret had given him. Sarah listened quietly as he described their meeting. By the time he finished, tears filled her eyes. "I'm happy for you," she said. "I really am." Ethan smiled. "So am I." Then his expression darkened. "But I think there's more to this story." Sarah frowned. "What do you mean?" Ethan pulled out the adoption documents he had received years earlier from his adoptive father. Among the papers was a single handwritten note. One he had never paid much attention to before. Now, however, it seemed important. Very important. The note read, "Some truths are buried because powerful people want them buried." Sarah looked confused. "Who wrote that?" "My adoptive father. And he never explained it." Ethan shook his head. "Never." The next morning Ethan called the investigator who had helped locate Margaret. Within hours they met at his office. Ethan handed him copies of the documents. The investigator studied them carefully. Then he stopped. "What is it?" Ethan asked. The man pointed toward a signature on one of the papers. Ethan leaned closer. His stomach tightened. The signature belonged to a social worker named Patricia Monroe. At first glance it seemed unimportant. But the investigator looked surprised. "I know that name." Ethan stared. "From where?" The investigator opened a computer file. Several minutes later he found what he was looking for. Then he slowly turned the screen toward Ethan. "I think you need to see this." Ethan's heart pounded. The screen displayed an old newspaper article from decades earlier. The headline shocked him. "Former adoption agency employee accused of illegal practices." His eyes widened. The article described accusations involving hidden records, falsified paperwork, and questionable adoption procedures. One name appeared repeatedly: Patricia Monroe, the same woman who had handled Ethan's adoption. A chill ran down his spine. "Are you saying my adoption wasn't legal?" The investigator shook his head. "Not necessarily. But something unusual happened." Ethan felt his pulse quicken. "What kind of unusual?" The investigator pointed toward another document. "According to these records, your mother attempted to withdraw consent shortly after signing." Ethan froze. "What?" "Look." The investigator highlighted a section. The document clearly stated that Margaret had requested a review only days after the adoption agreement. Ethan stared at the page. His breathing became shallow. This was the first time he had ever seen it. The first time anyone had shown it to him. "Why didn't I know about this?" The investigator sighed. "That's the question." Across town, Margaret sat in her living room sorting through old boxes. After meeting Ethan, she couldn't stop smiling. For the first time in decades, the house felt less lonely. Then she discovered something tucked inside an old envelope. A letter. One she hadn't seen in years. As she opened it, her hands began to tremble, because she suddenly remembered something she had almost forgotten. Something she had never told Ethan. Several hours later her phone rang. It was Ethan. She answered immediately. "Hello, Mom." The word caught her completely off guard. For a moment she couldn't breathe. He had called her mom. After 30 years. Tears instantly filled her eyes. "Yes. I found something." Margaret heard the tension in his voice. "What is it?" "There may have been problems with the adoption agency." Silence filled the line. Then Margaret whispered something shocking. "I know." Ethan sat upright. "You know." Her voice trembled. "There was a letter." "What letter?" "The one I just found." An hour later Ethan arrived at her house. For the first time, he stepped inside. Family photographs covered the walls. Pictures of birthdays, holidays, graduations, and among them were several empty frames. Ethan noticed them immediately. "Why are those empty?" Margaret smiled sadly. "I always hoped one day I'd have your picture." The answer hit him hard. They sat together at the dining table. Margaret handed him the old letter. The paper was yellow with age. Carefully, Ethan unfolded it. As he read, his face slowly changed. Shock. Confusion. Disbelief. The letter had been written by Patricia Monroe, the social worker, and it contained one sentence that changed everything. Your request to reverse the adoption cannot be processed because the child has already been relocated. Ethan looked up. What does that mean? Margaret's eyes filled with tears. It means I tried to get you back. His chest tightened. She continued. I went back 3 days later. Her voice broke. I begged them. Tears streamed down her face. I told them I'd made a mistake. What happened? They told me it was too late. Ethan felt numb. For nearly 50 years he had believed she simply let him go. But the truth was different. Far different. She had fought. She had begged. She had tried to stop it. And failed. What happened after that? Ethan asked quietly. Margaret looked toward the window. For a long moment she said nothing. Then she revealed another painful truth. I had a lawyer investigate years later. Ethan frowned. A lawyer? She nodded. He discovered records were missing. The room suddenly felt colder. Missing. Yes. She swallowed hard. Entire files disappeared. The investigator's suspicions were beginning to make sense. Important documents had vanished. Information had been hidden. Someone had made it incredibly difficult for mother and son to reconnect. But why? And who benefited from it? That evening Ethan drove home with more questions than answers. As he entered his house, he found Sarah waiting. She could immediately see something was wrong. What happened? Ethan handed her the letter. She read it slowly, then looked up in shock. Oh my God. Ethan nodded. I know. For several minutes neither spoke. Finally Sarah asked the question haunting both of them. Do you think someone intentionally kept you apart? Ethan stared at the floor. I don't know. But I'm going to find out. Late that night, unable to sleep, Ethan opened the final envelope his adoptive father had left behind. For years he had ignored it. Now curiosity overwhelmed him. Inside was a photograph. An old photograph. One he had never seen before. His hands began shaking. Because standing beside Margaret in the picture was a man. A man Ethan recognized instantly. Not from memory. From recent investigation files. The same man connected to the adoption agency scandal. And written on the back were 6 words. This man knows the real truth. Ethan stared at the photograph. His heart pounding. Because if his adoptive father was right, the story of his adoption was far from over. And the truth waiting at the end could change everything he thought he knew about his past. The man who knew the truth. Ethan barely slept. The photograph lay on his bedside table all night. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the words written on the back. This man knows the real truth. By sunrise, he had made a decision. He would find the man. No matter how long it took. No matter what he discovered. The next morning, Ethan met with the investigator again. He placed the photograph on the desk. The investigator studied it carefully. Then his eyes widened. I know who this is. Ethan leaned forward. You do. The investigator nodded slowly. His name is Robert Hale. The name meant nothing to Ethan. Who is he? The investigator sighed. 30 years ago, he served on the board of the adoption agency. Ethan felt his stomach tighten. Is he still alive? Yes. Where? The investigator hesitated, then handed Ethan a piece of paper. Wyoming. 3 days later Ethan and Sarah drove across state lines. The journey felt longer than it really was. Not because of distance. Because of anticipation. Every mile brought them closer to answers. Answers Ethan had waited his entire life to hear. Robert Hale lived on a quiet ranch surrounded by mountains. At 78 years old, he had retired from public life. When Ethan knocked on the door, an elderly man answered. His eyes immediately landed on the photograph in Ethan's hand. And his face turned pale. He recognized it instantly. Mr. Hale? Ethan asked. The old man nodded. I think we need to talk. For several seconds Robert said nothing. Then he stepped aside. Come in. The ranch house was simple and peaceful. Family pictures covered the walls. Grandchildren. Birthdays. Weddings. A lifetime of memories. Ethan couldn't help thinking about all the memories he and Margaret had lost. 30 years. Gone forever. After everyone sat down, Ethan placed the photograph on the table. Robert stared at it. His shoulders seemed to sag. Almost as if he had been carrying a burden for decades. Finally he spoke. I wondered if this day would come. Ethan's heart pounded. What day? The day someone came looking for the truth. The room fell silent. Robert looked directly at Ethan. I owe you an apology. Ethan froze. For what? The old man's eyes filled with regret. For not stopping what happened. Sarah exchanged a glance with Ethan. Neither spoke. They could feel the weight of the confession before it even arrived. Robert slowly stood and walked toward a bookshelf. From behind several old books, he pulled out a small metal box. The box looked ancient. Its corners were worn. Its lock was broken. Carefully he carried it back to the table. Then he opened it. Inside were dozens of documents. Letters. Reports. Agency records. Photographs. Evidence. 30 years old. Robert took a deep breath. The adoption itself was legal. Ethan felt a small sense of relief. But what happened afterward was not. The relief vanished immediately. What do you mean? Robert looked ashamed. Your mother tried to reverse the adoption. Ethan nodded. I know. She wasn't the only one. Ethan frowned. What? Robert opened one of the files. Inside was a copy of a letter. Signed by multiple people, including a lawyer, including a judge, including adoption officials. Ethan's eyes widened. The letter clearly showed concerns about how quickly his case had been processed. Questions had been raised. Reviews had been requested. But none of them moved forward. Why not? Ethan asked. Robert lowered his head. Because someone powerful intervened. The words hit the room like thunder. Who? Ethan asked. Robert didn't answer immediately. Instead, he reached into the box and removed another photograph. This one showed a wealthy businessman standing beside several adoption agency executives. Ethan stared. The face looked strangely familiar. Then realization hit him. He had seen that man before. Years ago. In an old photograph at his adoptive parents' house. His heart nearly stopped. No. Robert nodded slowly. Yes. Who is he? Sarah asked. Robert looked directly at Ethan. Your biological father. The room went completely silent. Ethan felt as though all the air had left his lungs. His biological father. The man Margaret said had abandoned her. The man she believed vanished before Ethan was born. That man. Robert nodded sadly. He didn't disappear. Ethan stared. What are you saying? He came back. Ethan couldn't speak. Robert continued. Your father came from a wealthy family. Very wealthy. He wanted his reputation protected. The old man looked sick with guilt. When Margaret became pregnant, his family panicked. Ethan's hands clenched into fists. They used money. They used lawyers. They used influence. And eventually, Robert looked away. They made sure the adoption couldn't be reversed. The words felt like a punch to the chest. For 30 years Margaret had blamed herself. For 30 years Ethan believed she simply gave him away. Meanwhile someone else had quietly controlled everything from the shadows. Did my mother know? Ethan asked. Robert shook his head. No. She believed he abandoned her. He wanted it that way. Anger surged through Ethan. Not at Margaret. Not at his adoptive parents. At the man who had stolen decades from both of them. Robert handed Ethan one final document. The old man's hands were shaking. I kept this because I couldn't live with my guilt. Ethan unfolded the paper. His eyes moved across the page. Then he stopped breathing. It was a letter, written by his biological father. Dated 30 years ago. The letter contained a sentence Ethan would never forget. Ensure there is no future contact between the mother and child. Sarah covered her mouth. Margaret's worst fears had been true all along. Someone had actively worked to keep them apart. Ethan felt physically sick. 30 years. 30 birthdays. 30 Christmases. 30 years of wondering. And all of it because one man cared more about protecting himself than protecting his family. Is he still alive? Ethan asked quietly. Robert nodded. Yes. The answer surprised everyone. Ethan stared. Where is he? The old man hesitated. Then he handed Ethan a business card. A modern business card. Recent. Current. Ethan looked at the name. His biological father wasn't hiding. He wasn't gone. He was living less than 200 miles away. All these years. Close enough to find. Close enough to know. Close enough to care. But he never did. Ethan's emotions became impossible to control. Confusion. Anger. Shock. Sadness. Everything collided at once. Before leaving, Robert stopped him at the door. There is something else. Ethan turned around. What? The old man's eyes filled with tears. Your father doesn't know I kept those records. Ethan frowned. Why does that matter? Robert swallowed hard. Because if he discovers you've found the truth. He paused. He may finally be forced to face what he did. As Ethan and Sarah drove home, neither spoke for nearly an hour. The mountains passed silently outside the window. Finally Sarah broke the silence. What are you going to do? Ethan stared at the road ahead. His jaw tightened. His eyes hardened. And for the first time in his life, he knew exactly what he wanted. I'm going to meet him. Hundreds of miles away, an elderly businessman sat alone in a luxurious office. Unaware that his past was racing toward him. Unaware that the son he had spent 30 years avoiding now knew the truth. And unaware that, within days, he would come face to face with the family he had abandoned. The confrontation. For 3 days, Ethan carried the business card in his wallet. He looked at it every morning. Every night. Every time he reached for his keys. The name printed on that card represented a lifetime of unanswered questions. A lifetime of pain. And now, finally, a chance to hear the truth from the man responsible. Margaret sat across from him in her living room. The documents from Robert Hale were spread across the coffee table. Neither had touched them in hours. I don't want you to do this because of me, Margaret said softly. Ethan looked at her. Mom. The words still brought tears to her eyes. Quote. I'm doing this because I need answers. Margaret nodded. She understood. For years she had wanted answers too. The following Monday, Ethan drove to a large office building in Denver. The company name stretched across the top floor. His biological father had built a business empire. Millions of dollars. Hundreds of employees. Awards. Recognition. Success. Yet none of those things impressed Ethan. Because no amount of success could replace 30 lost years. At the reception desk, Ethan gave his name. Minutes later, he was escorted upstairs. His heart pounded with every step. The secretary opened a large wooden door. Mr. Harrison will see you now. The door closed behind him. And there he was. William Harrison. 71 years old. Silver hair. Expensive suit. Sharp eyes. A powerful man. But as soon as he looked up and saw Ethan, something changed. The color drained from his face. Because he knew immediately who was standing before him. For several seconds, neither man spoke. The silence felt heavy. Almost unbearable. Finally William stood. Ethan. The fact that he knew his name made Ethan's stomach turn. You know who I am. William nodded slowly. Yes. The room became painfully quiet. Ethan reached into his jacket and placed the old letter on the desk. The letter Robert Hale had saved. William looked at it, then closed his eyes. Just for a moment, as if the weight of 30 years had suddenly landed on his shoulders. You kept us apart, Ethan said. Not a question. A fact. William didn't deny it. I did. The honesty surprised Ethan. He had expected excuses, lies, denials. Instead, he received a confession. Why? The word came out sharper than intended. William stared out the window. For a long time, he said nothing. Then finally he spoke. Because I was a coward. Ethan's fists tightened. When your mother became pregnant, I was 21. William's voice sounded distant. My family owned businesses throughout 3 states. He laughed bitterly. My father cared more about reputation than people. Ethan remained silent. He told me if the scandal became public, everything would collapse. So you abandoned her? William lowered his head. Yes. The answer was immediate. No excuses. No justifications. Only shame. Ethan felt anger rise inside him. Do you know what she went through? William nodded. Tears appeared in his eyes. More than you realize. For the first time, Ethan noticed something unexpected. This wasn't a powerful businessman sitting across from him. This was an old man carrying decades of regret. William opened a drawer and removed a photograph. He slid it across the desk. Ethan picked it up. His breath caught. It was a picture of him. At age 10, standing beside his adoptive parents. Ethan looked up in shock. What is this? William's voice trembled. I followed your life. The room spun. You what? I hired investigators. Ethan stared. For 30 years. William nodded. Every year. Every birthday. Every graduation. Every major milestone. He had watched from a distance. Never contacting him. Never revealing himself. Simply watching. The revelation hit Ethan like a wave. Part of him felt furious. Another part felt confused. You knew where I was all this time. William nodded. Yes. And you never came. The old man's eyes filled with tears. No. Why not? William looked broken. Because there was no good answer. Only the truth. I didn't believe I deserved to. The room fell silent. For decades William Harrison had lived with success. Money. Power. Respect. But none of it erased what he had done. And now it showed. In every wrinkle. Every tear. Every regret. Then William said something unexpected. Your mother deserved better. Ethan looked up. William continued. So did you. For a moment, Ethan saw a genuine remorse. Not performative. Not forced. Real. Painful. Human. William opened another drawer. This time he removed a thick stack of envelopes. Hundreds of them. He placed them on the desk. What are these? William swallowed hard. Letters. Ethan frowned. Letters. Letters I wrote to you. Ethan stared. There were dozens. Maybe hundreds. All addressed to him. None mailed. None opened. I wrote one every birthday. William's voice cracked. But I never sent them. Ethan picked up the top envelope. The date was from when he was 8 years old. Another from age 12. Another from 18. Another from 30. Decades of unsent apologies. Decades of fear. Decades of guilt. For the first time, Ethan realized something important. His father had not escaped the consequences. He had simply suffered them differently. Alone. In silence. Still, forgiveness was another matter entirely. You stole 30 years from us. William nodded. I know. You stole 30 years from her. More tears rolled down William's face. I know. The old man looked smaller now. Not powerful. Not intimidating. Just tired. Finally William spoke again. There is one thing I want. Ethan waited. William's voice barely rose above a whisper. I want to apologize to Margaret. Ethan stared at him. The request felt impossible, yet somehow necessary. That evening, Ethan drove away carrying the stack of letters. His mind raced. Everything was changing. Everything. When he arrived at Margaret's house, she immediately noticed his expression. What happened? Ethan sat down, then slowly told her everything. The confession, the letters, the years of secret observation, the apology, all of it. By the time he finished, Margaret was crying. Not because she forgave William. Not because she hated him. But because the truth she had searched for 30 years had finally arrived. And then Ethan asked the question neither of them expected. Would you meet him? Margaret froze. The room became silent. Because the answer to that question would determine whether old wounds finally healed. Or remained open forever. 30 years, one moment of truth. The night felt unusually quiet. No wind, no rain, just a stillness that made everything feel heavier than it was. Margaret sat by the window, holding a cup of tea that had gone cold hours ago. Across from her, Ethan waited. For the first time since their reunion, neither of them spoke for a long stretch. Because the question Ethan had asked was not simple. It was the kind of question that changes everything. Would you meet him? Margaret finally looked at him. Her eyes were tired, not from age, but from 30 years of waiting, searching, and surviving heartbreak. I don't know if I can, she admitted. Ethan nodded slowly. I understand. But he didn't push her. He didn't decide for her. He just sat there, waiting. The next morning, Margaret made a decision. I'll meet him, she said quietly. Ethan looked up immediately. You're sure? She hesitated for only a second. Then nodded. Yes. If I don't, I'll carry this forever. The meeting was arranged at a small lakeside cafe. Quiet, neutral, away from the noise of the city. Ethan drove her there. Neither of them spoke much during the ride. But Margaret's hands trembled the entire way. Not from fear of William Harrison. But from fear of the past finally becoming real. When they arrived, William was already there. Sitting alone at a wooden table near the water. He looked different. Not like the powerful businessman Ethan had met. But like an old man waiting for judgment. When he saw Margaret step out of the car, he stood immediately. And for a moment, he couldn't move. Neither could she. 30 years collapsed into a single breath. Margaret walked toward him slowly. Each step felt heavier than the last. William lowered his head. I wasn't sure you'd come, he said softly. Margaret stopped a few feet away. I almost didn't. Silence. The lake water moved gently behind them. William finally spoke. I don't deserve forgiveness. Margaret's voice was calm. No, you don't. That honesty hit him harder than anger would have. Ethan stood a little distance away, watching. He wasn't there to interrupt. He was there to witness. Because this was not his pain alone. It belonged to all three of them. William took a deep breath. I tried to control everything back then, he said. My family. My reputation. My fear. He looked at Margaret. But I couldn't control what I lost. His voice cracked. I lost both of you. Margaret's eyes filled instantly. You didn't lose us, she said quietly. You chose to let go. The words were sharp, but not cruel. Just true. William nodded. I know. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out an envelope. Then placed it on the table. I wrote this years ago. Margaret didn't touch it. I never sent it, he continued. Because I didn't think I had the right. He looked at Ethan then. And I spent my life watching from a distance, thinking that was enough. Ethan clenched his jaw. It wasn't. William nodded again. I know. A long silence followed. The kind where forgiveness either dies or begins. Margaret finally spoke. I hated you for a long time. William closed his eyes. I deserve that. But, she added softly, I also learned something. He looked up. What? Her voice softened. Hate doesn't bring back what's lost. Tears formed in William's eyes. I never wanted to hurt you, he whispered. But you did, Margaret replied. A pause. Then she added something unexpected. And I spent 30 years learning how to live with it. Ethan stepped forward slightly. Mom. She looked at him. He hesitated. Then said, what do you want to do? The question wasn't about William. It was about her peace. Margaret looked at the lake. The water reflected sunlight like broken glass. Slowly, she answered, I don't want revenge. She turned toward William. And I don't want to carry this anger anymore. William listened carefully. But I don't think forgiveness is something I can give you easily. William nodded. I don't expect it. Silence again. Then Margaret added, but I can try to let go. Those words changed the air completely. Not forgiveness, but release. A beginning, not an ending. William exhaled shakily. That's more than I deserve. Margaret looked at him directly. Yes, it is. For the first time, something softened between them. Not healing, but acceptance of truth. Ethan watched quietly. And for the first time, he saw something he never expected. Not a perfect reconciliation. Not a dramatic forgiveness. But 3 broken lives finally facing reality without lies. Before leaving, William turned to Ethan. I know I can't fix what I did, he said. But I want to try, if you'll allow it. Ethan didn't answer immediately. He looked at the man who had once been nothing more than a shadow over his life. Now he was just human. Flawed. Regretful. Still responsible. But human. Finally Ethan said, I don't know if I can forgive you. William nodded. That's fair. But, Ethan continued, I'm willing to understand you. That was not forgiveness. But it was a door opening. Just slightly. William's eyes filled again. That's enough for me. As the sun began to set over the lake, Margaret stood between the 2 men who had shaped her life in opposite ways. One she lost. One she never truly knew. And yet both were connected through her son. She looked at Ethan. Then at William. And quietly said, I think I'm done living in the past. A pause. Then she added, but I'm not erasing it either. Ethan nodded. Neither am I. William lowered his head. I understand. They stood there for a long time. No dramatic music. No perfect ending. Just 3 people finally telling the truth after 30 years of silence. Later that evening, Ethan drove Margaret home. As they reached her porch, she stopped him. I'm proud of you, she said softly. Ethan smiled faintly. For what? For finding the truth, without losing yourself in it. That stayed with him. When he returned home, Sarah was waiting. He sat beside her and finally let out a long breath he didn't realize he had been holding for days. It's not perfect, he said. But it's real now. Sarah held his hand. Sometimes that's the closest thing to healing there is. Weeks later, life didn't magically become easy. But it became honest. Margaret and Ethan rebuilt what time had broken, slowly, carefully, one conversation at a time. William remained a distant presence. Not erased. Not embraced. But acknowledged. A part of history that could not be changed. And Margaret, for the first time in 30 years, stopped waiting for the past to return. Because it already had. In the form of a son she thought she had lost forever. Please friends spot my channel, like, share, comment, subscribe for more stories. Thanks for watching.